You wake up, no buzzing phone, no good morning texts, no urgent meetings or weekend plans waiting to pull you out the door. Just quiet, just you. That silence, it feels strange, doesn't it? Like the world forgot about you. Like something is missing, but maybe it's not a loss. Maybe it's an invitation. Most men would rush to fill that silence, open their phones, scroll, text someone they shouldn't, anything to feel like they still matter. Because we've been taught that stillness is punishment, that solitude is failure, that a man without someone to love him, someone to need him, must be broken. But what if it's the opposite? What if the longer a man walks alone, not because he's unwanted, but because he refuses to settle, the more powerful he becomes? This video is not for everyone. It's not for men who chase noise just to avoid hearing their own thoughts. It's not for those who define their worth by how many likes they got last night or how many matches they pulled this week. It's for a different kind of man, a man who's tired of proving, tired of explaining, tired of being told that he's only valuable if he's chosen. This is for the man who's beginning to wonder, what if being single isn't a curse, but a forge? What if solitude isn't absence, but refinement? What if, in the quiet, you're not being forgotten but being rebuilt? If that question hits something in you, stay with me. Because over the next few minutes, we're going to talk about why the man who embraces solitude, who stops chasing approval, and who chooses to become whole on his own terms, becomes the most unforgettable presence in any room he enters. Not because he demands attention, but because his energy declares, I don't need to be chosen. I'd already chose myself, and that changes everything. Have you ever tried sitting in a room alone with no phone, no music, no screens, just silence? For most men, it starts off fine, but after a few minutes, the itch begins. The need to check something, to do something, to feel connected again. That itch isn't boredom, it's withdrawal. Withdrawal from the noise we've unknowingly become addicted to. You see, we live in a world that constantly floods us with stimulation, notifications, reels, ads, messages, updates, always something pulling our attention outward. We scroll not because we're curious, but because we're afraid of what will rise up in the silence if we stop. And the scariest part, we don't even notice it anymore. It feels normal to be distracted 247. I once knew a guy named Jordan, 27, smart, good job, decent shape. But he couldn't go a single evening without background noise, Spotify, TikTok, YouTube running while he cooked, while he cleaned, even while he slept. He wasn't lazy, he wasn't weak, but deep down he was afraid of being alone with his thoughts, not because he was broken, but because no one had ever taught him how to be still without feeling lost. The truth is, noise gives us cover. It lets us avoid reflection. It lets us pretend we're okay. But beneath that layer of distraction often lies confusion, doubt, even pain we haven't processed. And until we face that, we're just running in circles, successful maybe, but directionless. The lesson: silence isn't uncomfortable because it's empty. It's uncomfortable because it's honest. And here's the shift. Once you learn to sit through that honesty without flinching, it begins to reveal things noise never could. What actually matters to you, what needs to heal, and who you are when no one's watching. That's the beginning of power, not the loud, chest-thumping kind, but the quiet strength of a man who's no longer afraid of himself. And that leads us to the next question: what happens when a man finally looks in the mirror, with no filters, no audience, and nothing to hide behind? Let's talk about that next. There's a moment every man reaches, whether he expects it or not, a moment where the noise fades, the distractions fail, and he's left alone with his reflection. No filters, no validation, no mask, just raw truth. At first it's quiet, then the voices start to surface. You remember the job you turned down, the promise you made and broke, the girl who left because you weren't ready, the man you said you'd become and never did. This isn't punishment, it's a reckoning. Most men don't fear loneliness, they fear what loneliness reveals. It doesn't just highlight the absence of others, it amplifies the presence of truth. And truth, especially the kind we've avoided for years, can feel brutal. Take Marcus, for example. By day, he was a confident guy, well-dressed, articulate, always surrounded by people. But deep down, he never stopped moving because he was terrified of standing still. He once told me, "I'm scared of the version of me I meet in the quiet." That version reminded him of broken dreams, missed chances, and emotions he'd stuffed away behind his ambition. He wasn't running toward success, he was running from himself. And that's the silent story of so many men. We perform, we pursue, we please. But when the lights go out and the applause stops, what's left? It's easy to post quotes about growth. It's easy to lift weights, build muscles, and talk discipline. But the hardest reps you'll ever do are internal, the ones where you sit in your own story with no one else to impress. So here's the small but powerful truth. You can't become who you're meant to be until you confront who you've been avoiding. This moment, right here, right now, is the line in the sand. You can keep performing, keep pretending, keep jumping from one goal to the next. Or you can pause, you can listen, you can look your truth in the eye and not blink. Because the man who faces himself, flaws, failures, fears and all is already ahead of 95% of the world. And once you've faced the truth, the next step becomes clear. You stop reaching for others to validate your worth. You start asking a much deeper question: why did you ever need their approval to begin with? We'll unpack that next. Let's be honest, most of us don't reach for our phones because we need information. We reach because we want to be seen, to be noticed, to feel like someone, somewhere, still remembers we exist. That need is subtle but powerful. And over time, it becomes a kind of emotional dependency. One we mistake for connection. It starts innocently enough. A notification lights up and you feel a little rush. A message from her, a like on your story, a reply to your post. It's dopamine and it feels like approval. Like someone out there is saying, you matter. But here's the quiet danger: the more you depend on that signal from the outside, the more disconnected you become from the inside. I once met a guy named Ethan, mid-20s, ambitious, seemed confident. But every morning, the first thing he did wasn't stretch, breathe, or focus. He checked his messages. If he got a reply from a girl he liked, the day started off great. If not, he spiraled into doubt. Not because she was the love of his life, but because her silence made him question his worth. That's not love. That's addiction. When your mood is dictated by someone else's attention, you're not in a relationship, you're in withdrawal. And here's the irony: we chase these moments of digital validation thinking they connect us, but they actually keep us disconnected from who we really are. You laugh at things you don't find funny. You say yes when your soul is screaming no. You scroll, swipe, and shape yourself into whatever image you think will get the most applause. But applause fades. And when it does, you're left wondering if anyone ever truly saw you, or just the version of you kept performing. So what's the lesson? Approval isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers in habits we don't question. But once you start to notice where you're bending just to feel liked, you reclaim something rarer, your integrity. And from that place, something even deeper begins to emerge. Because when you stop chasing attention and start choosing honesty, you'll begin a detox that not only rewires your habits, but rewrites your identity. That's what we're going to explore next. How to break free from the cycle of approval and build the kind of inner voice that doesn't need to be liked to speak the truth. Breaking free from approval isn't a weekend cleanse. It's not a 3-day challenge where you log off social media and suddenly become a monk. It's war, slow, silent, internal. And the enemy, it's the part of you that still believes you need to be liked to be enough. The approval we crave didn't start last week. It started years ago. When you were praised for being polite, not honest. When you got attention only when you performed. When you learned that silence meant disapproval and rejection meant something was wrong with you. That belief sinks deep. So even as grown men, we shape our choices to avoid discomfort. We send the extra text, stay in conversations we've outgrown, agree with opinions we don't believe, all to keep the peace outside, even while we're crumbling inside. I knew a man named David who worked in sales. Outgoing, sharp, always smiling. But he told me one day, I'm exhausted pretending I'm okay with everything just to stay liked. He wasn't living. He was managing approval, always adapting, always editing himself depending on who was in the room. The scariest part, he didn't know who he was when he was alone. That's why detoxing from approval is so hard. Because it's not just about changing habits, it's about confronting identity. So how do you start? Start small, simple. Don't check your phone the moment you wake up. Pause. Let your mind exist before the world's voices enter. Stop replying out of obligation. Let silence be an answer. Say no without explaining. Speak your opinion, even if it doesn't fit the room. And most importantly, notice the discomfort. Because at first, it will feel like loss, like you're disappointing people, like you're drifting away. But what's really happening is this: you're creating space for your real self to finally breathe. Yes, it's uncomfortable. But discomfort isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's proof that you're stepping away from the version of you shaped by everyone else and toward the man you were meant to become. The approval detox doesn't make life quieter, it makes you clearer. And once that clarity begins to take root, a new kind of vision starts to form. One that isn't swayed by noise or validation. That's what we'll explore next. What happens when solitude sharpens not just your peace, but your purpose. There's a difference between being alone and being aligned. Most men fear solitude because they mistake it for emptiness, as if being alone means being abandoned, as if silence equals failure. But the truth, solitude, when chosen, not forced, isn't a void. It's a forge. It's the space where clarity begins. When you strip away the noise, the constant opinions, the invisible race to keep up, you're left with something rarer: yourself. Not the version you shaped to be accepted, not the image you curated online, just you. Real, unfiltered, honest. That kind of clarity isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. It arrives slowly, like a sunrise you almost miss. And suddenly you begin to notice things. What drains you? What energizes you? Who you become around certain people, and whether you even like that version of yourself. Take Noah, for example. A guy I met who decided to take a quiet month. No dating, no parties, no endless scrolling. Just time alone, reading, walking, writing, reflecting. He thought it would be peaceful. Instead, it was confronting. I realized, he said, how much of my life was designed around not disappointing people. Even my goals weren't really mine. That's the power of solitude. It doesn't just calm your mind, it sharpens it. It reveals what was never yours to begin with: expectations, standards, even dreams handed down by others. You begin to live with intention. You stop agreeing out of habit. You stop chasing just to keep up. You say no, not to reject others, but to stay loyal to your own direction. The lesson here isn't that solitude makes you better than anyone. It's that it finally introduces you to the man you were meant to become. And once you meet him, once you see what it feels like to live aligned, you start making different choices. You don't wake up just to survive the day. You don't follow trends just to feel current. You don't let random people shape your peace, because now your life begins to reflect who you truly are, not who the world convinced you to be. And here's the most powerful part: when you become clear on who you are, the people who belong in your life find you without effort. That's what we're going to explore next: how solitude doesn't just clarify your mind, but transforms your relationships. From a young age, most men are handed a script: be strong, don't cry, handle it, push through. And for a while, we follow that script without question. We learn how to nod and say I'm good, even when we're not. We laugh when it hurts. We lift heavy things, physically and emotionally, because we're told that's what real men do. But here's the quiet trap: over time, that script becomes a mask. You show up to work looking composed. You show up to your relationships trying to be the rock. You joke around with the guys, pretending nothing gets to you. But inside, you might be anxious, unclear, even lost. And because you've been trained to see emotional honesty as weakness, you suppress the very signals that could lead you to healing. Take Chris, for example. On the outside, He had it together, good job, clean cut, always composed. But in private he felt numb. He didn't feel joy, didn't feel grounded. He was exhausted from holding it all in. When he finally opened up during a quiet conversation, he said something that stuck with me. "I'm not strong. I'm just tired of pretending to be." And that's the truth for many men. We've confused strength with silence, with suppression, with pretending not to feel. But real masculinity isn't about how much you can carry without flinching. It's about how honest you can be with what's real inside you. It's about having the courage to say, "I don't have all the answers," and still choose to show up fully. Because a man who hides everything behind a mask may look strong, but he's brittle. One crack and everything shatters. But a man who embraces his whole self, his doubt, his fear, his heart isn't fragile, he's flexible. And that's real strength. The lesson: stop performing strength. Start embodying it. Let go of the idea that vulnerability makes you less of a man. Vulnerability, when owned, becomes presence. It becomes power. It's what allows you to build connections that actually mean something, and it's what helps you stop carrying pain that was never meant to be carried alone. So now the question becomes, if strength isn't about hiding your feelings, then what is it about? Let's look at that through the lens of modern relationships. And how many men chase connection for the wrong reasons. Let's be real, many men treat romantic relationships like medicine. Feeling lost, get a girlfriend. Feeling empty, find someone who gets you. Feeling directionless, at least having someone will make it feel okay. But here's the quiet truth that most men discover, usually after a few breakups, or worse, after years in the wrong relationship. A woman can love you deeply, but she cannot fix the parts of you that you refuse to face. It's not her job to complete you, it's yours. I remember talking to Ryan, a guy who had just gone through a painful breakup. She was perfect, he told me. Kind, supportive, beautiful. But even with her, I still felt disconnected. As we talked more, it became clear he didn't miss her as much as he missed the feeling of being wanted, validated, important. She made the ache go away, for a while. And when she left, the ache returned stronger than before. Why? Because he never addressed where it came from in the first place. He had handed someone else the responsibility of keeping him whole, and when they walked away, so did his sense of peace. That's not love. That's emotional outsourcing, and it's more common than we think. You see, when you haven't built inner stability, you end up placing your identity in someone else's hands. Every text matters. Every silence feels personal. Every disagreement feels like a threat to your worth. But here's the lesson: healthy relationships aren't born from need. They're born from wholeness. The kind of love that lasts doesn't come from trying to fill a hole in your chest. It comes from sharing the overflow of a life that's already full. So before you look outward, look inward. Build the foundation first. Know who you are when no one is watching. Define your values, your standards, your purpose. Learn to enjoy your own company. Learn to self-regulate. Learn to walk alone with clarity and peace. Because the man who needs a relationship to feel complete is always at risk of losing himself. But the man who chooses a relationship from a place of wholeness, he doesn't lose himself, he expands. And once you stop reaching for love to rescue you, you start to see clearly the other illusion we've all fallen for. The idea that there's such a thing as the right time to become who you're meant to be. Let's talk about that next. There's this idea many men carry, quietly tucked in the back of their minds: I'll get serious when the timing's right. When I've got more money, more experience, more clarity. When I meet the right person. When I feel ready. But here's the hard truth: ready is an illusion. It's a story your fear tells you to stay safe. And safety, while comforting, is often the very thing holding you back from becoming who you're meant to be. Let me tell you about Aaron. Smart guy, big ideas. He had plans to start his own business, move out of his hometown, finally take ownership of his life. But every time we talked, it was the same thing: not yet. Just need to build a bit more savings. Just need to feel more prepared. Just need to wait for the perfect moment. Years passed. and the perfect moment never came. He didn't fail because he lacked ability. He failed because he was loyal to timing instead of action. And that's the silent danger of waiting. You begin to mistake delay for wisdom. You tell yourself you're being patient, thoughtful, strategic. But deep down, it's not strategy. It's hesitation dressed in logic. It's fear hiding in a suit. The reality: growth doesn't happen in ideal conditions. It happens in tension, in risk, in movement. The gym doesn't get easier before you lift the weight. The mountain doesn't lower before you climb it. Life doesn't pause and ask, "Are you ready?" It just keeps moving. And if you're not moving with it, you're falling behind, even if you're standing still. So what's the lesson? You don't need the perfect plan. You need the first step. You don't need total clarity. You need courage. You don't need someone else's permission. You need your own commitment. When you stop waiting for life to feel easier and start acting from where you are, imperfect, unsure, in progress, you shift from being passive to powerful. And here's the beautiful part: you don't have to know the entire path. You just need to take the next step with full presence, because movement creates momentum, and momentum reveals who you're becoming. Now, you might be thinking, what happens when the motivation fades? When that first burst of energy disappears, and you're left with the hard part, the discipline to keep going. That's exactly what we'll explore next. When desire fades, what remains? Let's talk about building a life rooted in discipline, not mood. Desire is beautiful. It gives us that first spark, the rush of energy to start something new. It's the gym membership bought at midnight, the journaling habit you commit to after a deep podcast, the business plan you sketch out after watching someone else succeed. But here's what no one tells you: desire never lasts. Eventually, the energy dips. The gym feels like a chore. The journal stays blank. The business plan gathers dust. And that's where most men quit, not because they're incapable, but because they mistook desire for discipline. Discipline is different. Desire says, "I feel like doing this." Discipline says, "I'll do this even when I don't feel like it." And that difference is everything. Think of Jake, a guy I met who lost 40 pounds in a year. When I asked what changed for him, he smiled and said, "I stopped waiting to be motivated. I just made it part of who I am." He didn't have a magic routine. He didn't even enjoy most workouts, but he showed up every day because he knew results don't follow excitement, they follow consistency. That's what most men miss. We chase the high. We want every morning to feel powerful. But the truth is, greatness is built on boring days, quiet days, days when no one sees, no one claps, and you do it anyway. And that's where the shift happens, from mood to identity. You stop being the guy who works hard when he feels it. You become the man who honors his word, even to himself. So here's the lesson: your habits will outlive your hype. And the man who learns to act in the absence of motivation becomes unstoppable, because now he doesn't wait for the wave. He creates it. Discipline isn't about perfection. It's about integrity. You miss a day, fine. You show up the next. You fall off track. No shame, just realignment. You stop thinking in all or nothing. You start thinking in decades. Because real strength isn't built in a week. It's built in silence, repetition, and commitment to becoming someone your past self would admire and your future self will thank. And once you start living that way, something else begins to shift around you, not just inside, but in your relationships, your environment, your circle. Which brings us to the next question: who you spend time with. Is it helping you grow or holding you back? Let's dive into that next. There's a saying you've probably heard: you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. But most men never stop to ask the deeper question: do the people around me reflect the man I'm trying to become, or the version of me I'm trying to outgrow? It's not about blaming anyone, it's about awareness. Because your environment shapes your standards subtly, quietly, and over time. If your closest friends normalize complaining, quitting, or staying stagnant, you'll start doing the same. Not because you're weak, but because we naturally mirror the energy we're exposed to most often. I once knew a guy named Leo. Talented, driven, full of potential. But he kept himself surrounded by friends who weren't bad people, they just weren't growing. Every weekend was drinks, gossip, video games. And over time, Leo's vision started shrinking. His ambition dulled. He didn't even notice until one night he admitted, "I don't know who I am outside of these hangouts." That's the moment it clicked. He wasn't just spending time with people, he was becoming them. So he made a hard choice. He started creating space. Not with anger, not with drama, just distance. He began reaching out to men who were building things, businesses, families, inner discipline. Conversations changed. So did his habits. So did his identity. This is your invitation to do the same. Take inventory. Write down the 5 people you spend the most time talking to, texting, hanging out with. Then ask, are they building or escaping? Do they challenge me or comfort me? Do I leave conversations with clarity or with compromise? It doesn't mean you cut people off cold. It means you start choosing proximity with more intention. Because growth requires friction, and if everyone in your circle agrees with you all the time, chances are you're not growing together. You're just floating. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Your standards are contagious, so are theirs. Choose wisely. When you upgrade your environment, your habits follow. When you surround yourself with men of purpose, your excuses shrink. And when you create space for alignment, something rare begins to emerge: clarity in how you show up, what you tolerate, and what you're building toward. And that clarity, it gives you the confidence to say something most men never dare to know, not to hurt, but to protect. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next: why learning to say no might be the most powerful shift a man can make. Most of us were never taught how to say no. Not clearly, not confident. Especially as men, we're often conditioned to be agreeable, to go along, to keep the peace. Say yes to the extra shift. Yes to the party you don't want to attend. Yes to staying quiet when something doesn't sit right. But here's the problem: every time you say yes to something that misaligns with your values, you're saying no to yourself. And the cost of that, it adds up, quietly, painfully. I remember talking to Eli, a guy who always seemed busy, always helping someone, always pulled in 5 different directions. Outwardly, he looked generous. But beneath the surface, he was exhausted. "I don't even know what I want anymore," he said. "It's like I've built my whole life on avoiding conflict." And that's what many of us do. We confuse kindness with compliance. We think being liked is the same as being respected, but they're not. Here's the truth. Every no you avoid out of fear becomes a silent yes to resentment. And resentment toward others, toward yourself, quietly poisons your peace. But when you begin to say no, everything changes. Not as a weapon, but as a boundary, not to reject others, but to protect your energy, your time, your direction. At first, it feels uncomfortable, maybe even selfish, but that discomfort is part of the shift. It's the friction of rewiring a life built on pleasing into one built on purpose. Start small. Say no to that plan you don't want to attend. Say no to answering texts when you need rest. Say no to conversations that drain instead of deepen. Say no to commitments that no longer reflect who you are. Because every time you say no with intention, you make space for something greater: alignment, clarity, and energy for what actually matters. Here's the lesson: no is not rejection, it's direction. It's the voice of a man who's no longer living by default. It's a signal to yourself and the world that your time, peace, and purpose are no longer up for negotiation. And once you start drawing those lines, you create a kind of stillness that isn't about isolation, it's about presence. And that stillness, that's where real power lies. Which leads us into the next piece of the puzzle: why stillness, when chosen, is not weakness, but a form of precision most men never access. Stillness is misunderstood. To most, it looks like doing nothing, sitting quietly, waiting, not reacting. And in a world addicted to movement, where hustle is praised and silence feels awkward, stillness is often mistaken for weakness. But here's the truth: stillness is not the absence of action, it's the presence of intention. It's the space between stimulus and response. The pause before you speak, the breath before you act. the moment where you choose clarity over reaction. I met someone named Julian, a former athlete turned entrepreneur. He was used to pushing, always doing, always reaching. But after a burnout that landed him in the hospital, he started practicing stillness. 10 minutes in the morning, no phone, no noise, just breathing, listening, noticing. At first, it felt like a waste of time, he told me. But over a few weeks, I realized I wasn't making better decisions before, I was just making faster ones. Stillness gave me space to choose. And that's the shift. Most people react. Few people respond. Most speak to fill silence. Few speak because they have something meaningful to say. Most chase movement. Few move with weight. Stillness gives your actions gravity. You stop doing things to prove your worth. You start doing things because they align with it. Think of a seasoned fighter. He doesn't flail, he doesn't waste energy. Every move is efficient, purposeful, precise. That's not laziness, that's mastery. The same applies to how you show up in life. Here's the lesson. The man who learns to be still can't be manipulated, can't be rushed, can't be provoked. Because he doesn't move from emotion, he moves from clarity. And when you stop reacting to every distraction, every invitation, every expectation thrown your way, you reclaim your power, not to control everything around you, but to control how you show up within it. Stillness isn't passive. It's focused, it's rooted, it's calm without losing alertness. And from that place, something else becomes possible. You begin to feel again. Not just think. You begin to process, not just push through. You begin to access strength that doesn't come from pushing harder, but from standing still and not blinking. Which brings us to something men have been taught to hide, suppress, or ignore: emotion, not as weakness, but as one of your greatest sources of power. Let's talk about that next. Somewhere along the way, many of us were taught a dangerous message: real men don't feel. Or if they do, they don't show it. Tears are weakness. Sadness is shameful. Vulnerability is soft. So we adapted. We bottled up the grief. We masked the disappointment. We turned anxiety into sarcasm and pain into silence. And for a while it worked, or at least it looked like it did. But beneath the surface, things pile up. And eventually, the weight of unexpressed emotion doesn't just affect your heart. It clouds your clarity, shapes your choices, and hardens your presence. I once met a man named Tyler. Strong, focused, reliable. The kind of guy everyone leaned on. But when his father passed away, he didn't cry, didn't talk, didn't take time to process. I just kept working, he said. It's what I do. But months later, the cracks showed up in his sleep, in his mood, in the way he started pushing people away. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to carry that grief without burying himself under it. That's the thing about emotion. What you don't process will eventually express itself, just not in ways you get to control. And emotion isn't your enemy, it's your signal system. Anger tells you where your boundaries are being crossed. Sadness points to something valuable that's been lost. Fear shows you what matters to you. Even tears, yes, tears can be a sign that something real is moving through you. Stoicism is often misunderstood here. People think it means being numb, untouchable, unbothered. But true Stoicism isn't about avoiding emotion. It's about not being owned by it. You feel it, you sit with it, you understand it, and then you choose your response, not from panic, but from principle. That's strength. The man who can feel without folding, who can sit with his emotions without letting them define his identity, that man is dangerous in the best way. Because he's honest. He's present, and he's not afraid of himself. Here's the lesson: emotion isn't weakness. It's data, it's depth, it's power when channeled with wisdom. And when you start living that way, rooted, aware, responsive instead of reactive, you stop chasing validation. You stop hiding behind jokes or silence. You start speaking from truth, not performance. And that shift creates something rare: a life you no longer need to explain or defend, because it's built on your own terms, which leads us to a powerful turning point. You no longer wait to be chosen. You start building something of your own. Let's talk about that next. At some point, every man faces a choice: spend your life waiting to be picked, noticed, validated, or start building something that stands with or without applause. For a long time, I chose the first path. Maybe you did too. We apply for approval. We audition in relationships. We wait for someone to text back, to see us, to tell us we're doing okay. And in that waiting, we shrink, we overthink. We forget we're builders, not beggars. Let me tell you about Mark. For years, he poured his energy into trying to impress others. A new outfit, a better job title, a carefully curated image. But it never felt like enough. Because every ounce of validation he received came with a hidden cost. He was building on borrowed ground. Then one day, he stopped asking for permission. He went quiet on social media, took a break from dating, started learning new skills, built a side business, not to prove anything, but because he finally asked himself, what do I actually want to create? 6 months later, he didn't look louder. He looked stronger. Not because of what he said, but because of what he was building when no one was watching. That's the shift, when you stop begging for a seat at someone else's table and build your own. You don't need to be the loudest. You don't need to chase attention. You just need to become the kind of man whose presence speaks without volume. And building isn't just about money or business. It's about building character. Build habits that align with who you say you are. Build boundaries that protect your peace. Build a vision that makes you proud, even if no one claps for it yet. Because when you build from the inside out, the world starts responding differently. Not because you begged it to, but because now your energy doesn't ask, it declares. Here's the lesson: a man who builds doesn't fear being overlooked, because he knows what he's becoming. And once you step into that mindset, solitude becomes strategy. You stop seeing your time alone as lonely and start seeing it as leverage, which is exactly what we'll dive into next. How to use solitude not as escape, but as a personal training ground for the life you're ready to lead. Solitude isn't just a break from the world, it's a workshop. It's where clarity is shaped, where identity is reforged, where men stop performing and start preparing. And when approached with intention, solitude becomes less about isolation and more about integration, a return to who you truly are beneath the noise. Most men avoid solitude because they see it as a waiting room, a pause between relationship, a lull between jobs, a sign that something's missing. But what if that missing space is the exact thing that's meant to sharpen you? Take Daniel. After a difficult breakup and a stalled career, he found himself completely alone for the first time in years. No partner, no job title to flex, just long, quiet evenings. At first he spiraled, the silence screamed, but slowly he stopped filling it with distractions and started asking better questions. Who am I without applause? What does my time say about my values? What kind of man do I want to become? And what would that man do today? He started building, not loudly, not perfectly, but daily. Morning workouts, not for a six-pack, but for self-respect. Reading not to impress, but to understand. Budgeting not to be rich, but to become responsible. Meditation not to escape thoughts, but to meet them. And that's the power of strategic solitude. It becomes your private dojo where you train unseen, where no one claps, where progress is invisible, until one day your presence shifts. You walk differently, speak more clearly. You don't need to prove, because you know. Here's a framework you can use: body build strength and resilience. Move daily, sweat with purpose, mind read, journal, question. Own your thoughts before they own you. Wealth create systems. Save, learn, invest, even in small ways. Vision, define your standards. Write down what matters, live by it. The lesson: solitude is only wasted when it's treated as survival instead of preparation. When you train in the quiet, the world eventually feels different. Not because it changed, but because you did. And soon, the man who once felt forgotten in silence becomes the one who doesn't flinch in chaos. Calm, clear, grounded, which leads us to the next moment in the journey, when you finally re-enter the world, not desperate, but rebuilt. Let's talk about what that return looks like and why it changes everything. There comes a point in every man's journey where the silence has done its work. The chaos has settled. The rebuilding is underway. And now it's time to step back into the world. But here's the difference this time. You're not returning as who you were. You're not stepping out to seek validation. You're not chasing attention. You're simply walking forward as a man who knows who he is and no longer needs the world's permission to live like it. I think of James, a client who spent nearly a year focusing on himself after a divorce. No dating, no social media updates. Just work, deep internal work. He read daily, got back into shape, rebuilt his finances, and most importantly, got honest about who he wanted to be. When he reconnected with old friends and stepped into new circles, people noticed. They couldn't name it exactly, but his presence felt different. He wasn't louder. He was still. He didn't have something to prove. He had something to offer. And that's the quiet power of a man who's done the work in the dark. The return isn't flashy. It's not a cinematic comeback with theme music. It's subtle, solid, steady. And because you're no longer looking to be chosen, you start choosing your habits, your people, your path. You're not easily swayed, not because you're stubborn, but because you've met yourself in the silence, and that kind of clarity is unshakable. Here's the lesson. When you've trained in solitude, the world doesn't overwhelm you, it adjusts to you. You no longer chase alignment. You embody it. You no longer force connection, you attract it. Because people feel when a man walks into a room rooted, unbothered, and fully present. And yet, there's a temptation that waits here too. Once you've felt this strength, it's easy to confuse detachment with disconnection. To build walls so thick, nothing gets in, not even the good. That's why the next step isn't to stay closed. It's to learn how to hold your peace without shutting out the world. Which brings us to something most men misunderstand: how to let go. Not as escape, but as an act of true inner freedom. Let's explore that next. There's a fine line between detachment and disconnection. One heals you, the other hardens you. After walking through solitude, reclaiming your voice, setting boundaries, and building discipline, many men begin to feel something new: peace. Not just quiet, but inner stillness. And with that peace often comes a powerful instinct to protect it at all costs. But sometimes, in protecting our peace, we build walls instead of boundaries. We stop feeling. We stop trusting. We tell ourselves we're above it, but deep down, we've just stopped allowing anything to get close enough to matter. That's not detachment. That's avoidance. True detachment isn't about turning your back on the world. It's about learning how to hold space for life without being consumed by it. I remember Alex, a man who had done a lot of work on himself, Stoic quotes on his wall, daily workouts, a schedule tighter than most CEOs. But when someone asked him a simple question, when was the last time you truly let someone in? He went quiet. Because in his pursuit of control, he'd cut off connection. He wasn't reacting to life anymore, but he also wasn't engaging with it. And here's what he learned. Detachment isn't about not caring. It's about caring deeply and refusing to let it control you. You can love someone and still let them walk away. You can feel disappointed and still move with grace. You can show up fully and still not tie your worth to how it's received. The power of detachment is presence without possession. You give, not to get. You listen, not to respond. You let go, not because it doesn't matter, but because you do. That's the lesson. You are allowed to feel everything and still choose peace. When you embody that, life flows differently. Conversations become lighter. Disagreements lose their sting. Even your goals stop feeling like pressure and start feeling like purpose. Because you're no longer grasping, you're grounded. And once you arrive at that place, not empty, but full, you no longer need to explain yourself, fix others, or force outcomes. You simply lead. Which brings us to the final step: how to walk through the world not as someone needing to be seen, but as someone whose presence speaks for itself. Let's finish this journey together. You've done the work, sat with the silence, faced your reflection, broke free from approval, rebuilt your routines, let go of what wasn't yours to carry. And now, something's different. You no longer chase alignment. You are alignment. There's a weight to you now, a calm that isn't loud, but unmistakable. The kind of energy that walks into a room and changes the temperature, not by demanding attention, but by radiating presence. This is what it means to lead from within. Leadership isn't always titles or speeches. It's not about how many follow you or how many listen. It's how deeply you've learned to listen to yourself. I once met a man named Samuel. He wasn't flashy, didn't have a big online presence, but when he spoke, people leaned in. When he made decisions, they landed with clarity. When he walked into a room, he never had to say, "Respect me." He simply was respected. Because he had nothing to prove, only something to offer. And that's the final lesson. When a man is rooted in who he is, the world doesn't shape him, he shapes the world around him. You speak less, but your words land deeper. You take up less space, but your presence feels fuller. You don't compete, you contribute. Because you've stopped living to be seen, you live to see clearly. This is the kind of man the world desperately needs more of, not reactive, not performative, but anchored. A man who knows where he stands even when no one claps. A man who doesn't follow noise, but follows principles. A man who can lead not from ego, but from example. And here's what's beautiful. You don't need a massive platform. You don't need 1 million followers. You just need to live honestly, speak truthfully, and move with intention. And that will leave a mark deeper than any algorithm ever could. So, as we wrap this journey, I'll leave you with one final thought. You don't have to chase power, love, success, or recognition. You just have to become the man who naturally attracts all four, not because he needs them, but because he embodies them. Now tell me, what's the first thing you're letting go of, so you can step into the man you were always meant to be? Drop it in the comments. And if something in you shifted during this journey, hit like, subscribe, and most of all, lead others to this space by simply living the way few men dare to live, from the inside out.